Hello. Welcome to our study of First Thessalonians. I'm Larry Smith. I'm the interim pastor of the First Christian Church of Fort Thomas. This is part of our community Bible study. This is a program that the church has sponsored for years, trying to help our community know and understand and love the Bible better. We're studying First Thessalonians today because of its importance. It's important for a number of different reasons. It's probably the first book in the New Testament to have been written. It's probably the first book that Paul wrote that became part of the New Testament. There were probably other writings, some of which may have been earlier than these, but they have not been preserved, and some of them we might have some references to, but we don't have those books themselves. It's very helpful for us to understand a little bit about the church at Thessalonica and a little bit about Paul as we begin this study of Paul's letter to the church there at Thessalonica. The city of Thessalonica itself was founded by Cassandra in 315 BC. Cassandra was an important general under Alexander the Great, and after the death of Alexander, Cassandra got a whole portion of the lands that Alexander had conquered. The general himself did well in military life, and he also did well in political life. He married the half-sister of Alexander the Great, Thessalonica, and it's after her that the city of Thessalonica is named. It was begun in 315 and encompassed an excellent seaport in the northwest Aegean Sea. The excellent port was surrounded by a large, fertile agricultural region that provided a ready access for food for those working in the city. At the time of its founding, Thessalonica was on a major north-south land route from southern portions of Greece and central Greece and to the areas of Thrace to the north. Later, under Roman domination, a major east-west road was created which connected Rome with what is today Turkey, or what was then known as Asia, or Asia Minor. And as you might suspect, it became a major transportation and commercial hub. Big city, a rich city, and attracted people from many different areas of the world. Merchants came there and set up their shops. Tradesmen came and set up their trades. Seamen came and went. But many people from many places. Among the people who came to Thessalonica were some Jews. We don't know exactly how many immigrated there, but there was a well-known and established Jewish community when Paul comes to the city. We have later references to a small Samaritan community in Thessalonica, but we don't know if that was there when Paul was there or not. In the year 168, Thessalonica was conquered by the Romans, and things change in the city. It's governed by and from Rome, but as part of the conquest, the Romans extracted a huge tribute from the city, and the city was able to pay it. So it must have been a pretty rich city. In the civil wars that encompassed and embraced Rome after the assassination of Julius Caesar, the city leaders at Thessalonica supported the right candidate, i.e. the one who won. That was Octavian. And in the aftermath of Octavian's victory, he granted the city of Thessalonica the status of a free city, giving it more rights and freedoms and responsibilities. The religious scene in Thessalonica was similar to many cities in the Roman period. Cities like Corinth, for instance, follow pretty much the same pattern. There were a diversity of religions. Probably the most widely practiced were the more or less traditional Greco-Roman deities, the worship of gods and goddesses. The Greeks associated with Mount Olympus, and Mount Olympus was visible on a clear day from Thessalonica. So you have that close tie-in with the traditional religions. There was also worship of the emperor. This was empire-wide pretty much, and was designed to keep all the people united in one series of religious practices which focused on the emperor. There was the worship of Dionysus and Orpheus that come out of the Greco-Roman tradition, out of the Egyptian traditions, the worship of Isis and Osiris. There was also a Jewish synagogue, or maybe several, we don't know. Important in these synagogues were not only the Jewish co-religionists for Paul, but there were also a number of what we call God-fearers. The God-fearers were Gentiles who worshiped with the Jews. They did a lot of different things with the Jews. We saw in the book of Acts Cornelius, who was well respected in the Jewish community, but he was a Gentile. He was a God-fearer. And this group of people, the Gentiles who were associated with Jewish worship and practices, but had not converted to Judaism, and some who had converted to Judaism, these would be an important element among the people whom Paul would attract to Christianity. The Acts of the Apostles is one source of information about the life of Paul. The letters of Paul are a second source. And so we have two sources, so to speak. We have Luke's account of Paul in the book of Acts, and Paul's autobiographical material in the writings of Paul. Over half of the book of Acts deals with Paul and his life. And it's kind of organized into a historical chronicle, if you will. The books of Paul's writings, Galatians, 2 Corinthians, 1 Thessalonians, the principal autobiographical sections are found in these writings, are not systematic and sort of chronological portrayals. They are utilized by Paul to present points that he's trying to make theologically, or in some cases simply to defend himself against attacks. Well, the problem that historians and Bible scholars have when they look at these two sources is that they're very difficult to try and reconcile. You have this chronology in Acts, and you have these periodic episodes that are discussed by Paul in his autobiographical sections, and they're hard to fit in. I spent a day and a half one time just trying to get these things organized, and I gave up just after the Damascus Road experience. After that, it was too many decisions that had too many ricochet effects, and it was just very, very difficult to construct. Personal information about Paul. We have a number of little tidbits of information scattered throughout the book of Acts and in Paul's writings. Here is some of the most significant of those facts. Paul's father was a Pharisee and a Roman citizen. Paul was from the tribe of Benjamin. If you remember your Hebrew Bible or Old Testament, the first king of the United Kingdom was named Saul, and he was from the tribe of Benjamin. When we are introduced to Paul, he's called Saul. And so you have that connection with the historic roots of Paul's family in the name. Paul says that he's a Hebrew of Hebrews. That's kind of a weird construction, but it's a Semitic form of writing the superlative. You see it, hear it in Handel's Messiah. Lord of Lords and King of Kings. The greatest Lord, the greatest King. In this case, the greatest of Hebrews, the best of Hebrews. Paul was born in Tarsus. Tarsus was a coastal city, in some ways very similar to Thessalonica. It was a port city, had people from all over, including a substantial Jewish community. Tarsus is on the Mediterranean coast of Turkey to the east, so it's in the very southeast of what is today Turkey. He has at least one sister that we know about, but she's not named, and she has a son, likewise not named, and they both lived in Jerusalem. After Paul's arrest in the temple, close to the end of his ministry, his nephew picks up word that there's going to be an assassination attempt against Paul, brings it to the authorities of the in Jerusalem that have Paul under arrest, and they take Paul by night down to Caesarea. At Caesarea, he spends 2 years there, and then he's sent to Rome. But we don't know the sister's name or her son's name, but he must have had some family who lived in Jerusalem, and this is maybe why he goes to Jerusalem to study. He has relatives named Andronicus and Junia, who became Christians before Paul's conversion. So even before his conversion, he had contact with people who had very early knowledge of Jesus and were very early followers of Jesus. He had a relative named Herodian. Well, Herodian is obviously named after Herod, and so we expect that the family was closely connected to King Herod and his family and their government of Judea. Like Pharisees in general, he learned a trade, a way of making a living. Many Pharisees were scribes, and that's why they're often named scribes and Pharisees, or Pharisees and scribes in the New Testament. But he learned the trade of leatherworking. Sometimes identified as a tent maker, and he may well have made tents exclusively, but the word itself is a little more general and refers to people who work with leather. So he had a trade. He had a day job. He was raised in Jerusalem, when we saw where his sister and his nephew lived there. Was instructed in the Torah, that is the law of the customs and practices of the Jews. He was instructed by one of the leading Pharisees of his day, Gamaliel. Gamaliel is mentioned in the book of Acts, but he is one of the most important Pharisaic teachers of Paul's time. He identifies himself as a member of the council. We're not sure exactly what that meant. If he meant the Sanhedrin, he was probably too young before his conversion to Christianity to be a member of the council, but we don't know exactly when he was born or how old he was at his conversion, and so forth. Paul writes to the Corinthians that he has a thorn in the flesh. Well, no one I know takes that very literally, and we try to figure out what it might mean. And there are lots of different explanations about what this thorn in his flesh was. One commentator said that the thorn in his flesh was his wife. Personally, I think that comment is more self-reflective than it was descriptive of Paul. Those who give an opinion tend to favor poor eyesight. And as many of us age, we know that our eyesight declines. And that may be the case, but we don't know exactly. But in any case, it's something that hindered his ministry. He tells us that he bears the marks of Christ on his body. Now, there are two different interpretations of this. One is that Paul bore what comes to be known as the stigmata. The stigmata is the technical term for the 5 wounds of Christ. 2 in the hand, 2 in the feet, and 1 in the side. The 5 wounds of Christ. And some say Paul bore the stigmata. Probably more common is the idea that, like Jesus, Paul was whipped and beaten with rods, and he was beaten because of his support of Jesus. So the marks of Jesus, the marks of his teaching about Jesus are displayed in his flesh as those wounds had healed up. He mentions a man by the name of Rufus, and he also mentions that they have the same mother. Well, we don't know whether Rufus was literally a brother of Paul or not. We tend to think not. We tend to think that Paul is describing Rufus as being a close friend, and Rufus's mother would be like what we would call a social mother, as opposed to a biological mother. She was one who had a great deal of influence in his life, in other words. But how Rufus got from Tarsus or Jerusalem to Rome, we don't know. Paul tells the church at Corinth that he wants everyone to remain like he is, single, but it doesn't say whether Paul was a widower or a bachelor. We don't know whether his wife died or if he never got married. But at any rate, late in his ministry, when he writes 1 Corinthians, he is not married. Well, utilizing the book of Acts, since it is an orderly chronology, let's look at a brief history, biography of the Apostle Paul. Born in Tarsus, we don't know what year. Some people give the year 6, but that's just a guess. Somewhere along the way, he got transferred to Jerusalem, where he studied and became very closely associated with some of the important figures in the history of Judaism, in the government of Judaism at the time. And he was given authority to arrest Jews who were teaching and preaching and believing in Jesus. Then he has this conversion experience. Some call it a call experience. Some call it a commissioning experience. Some call it the Damascus Road experience. He's going to Damascus in order to round up Christians, imprison them, and some of them may well have been put to death. But this Damascus Road experience is so important in Luke that it's recorded 3 times. There's a historical narrative that Luke presents in chapter 9, and then in chapters 22 and 26, Paul is talking and using this to explain his beliefs and his life. Well, after the Damascus Road experience, we have just 1 or 2 little tidbits of information about Paul for the next few years. He did missionary work in Arabia, and that's about all we know. But in and around the year 44, we're not sure, Barnabas goes to Tarsus to get Paul and bring him back to Antioch to help with the revival that's going on there, the missionary work, the evangelistic work that's being done in Antioch. A couple years later, the church at Antioch sent Paul and Barnabas and Mark on what we call the first missionary tour, or Paul's first missionary tour. And they go to Cyprus and parts of Turkey and then come back. And they found out that they had created a brouhaha in the church, and they have to go down to Jerusalem. And in Acts 15, you have the discussion of the Jerusalem conference. You also find an account of it in Galatians chapter 2. And here Paul and Barnabas argue for what in effect is bringing Gentiles into the church directly without them becoming Jews first. So this is a very important decision in the history of the church. Now, Gentiles did not have to become Jews first before they could become Christian. Well, after the Jerusalem conference, Paul goes on his second missionary tour. And this missionary tour leads him to Philippi, and he's run out of town, and then he goes to Thessalonica and preaches, and in essence is run out of Thessalonica as well. He goes to Berea and Corinth, and then to Athens, and then Corinth. But in Corinth we have our major hard date in Paul's biography. In Acts, he appears before Gallio. Gallio was an important figure in Roman life. Now, and we know, or think we know, that probably in the year 51, he becomes the head honcho of the Roman Empire in Corinth. There's some who argue that it might be 52, but one of those 2 dates, he is in Corinth. And Paul is brought to him after some time in Corinth. So we don't know exactly when Paul got there. Some say 50, some say 51, but somewhere in that area. And while it's not absolutely certain, it's pretty sure that Paul was in Corinth in the year 51. Paul goes back to Antioch and then starts the third missionary tour. The thing that's distinctive about the third missionary tour is that Paul is collecting money for the church in Jerusalem. And we'll see a little later that 2 of the people from the church at Thessalonica were sent as trustees of the money collected at Thessalonica to be turned over to the Jewish Christians in Jerusalem. In or about the year 58, Paul goes to Jerusalem at the conclusion of the third missionary journey with that offering, but he's arrested, put under protective custody, and then spirited out of Jerusalem, as we mentioned earlier, to Caesarea. He's in Caesarea for 2 years. Then he takes a long, ill-advised sea tour to Rome, and the book of Acts ends with him preaching in Rome. The Romans don't hinder his preaching any, but he's still under what we would call house arrest. And that's where Luke ends his story of Paul. There are a number of traditions about Paul. They boil down into two different categories here. There are those traditions that say Paul was freed by the Romans and he went and preached in Spain. And there are some churches in Spain that claim Paul as their founder. On the other hand, there are those who say Paul remained in jail until Nero began persecuting the Christians, and he died after a long imprisonment in Rome. We don't know, but the traditions are fairly strong and straightforward that Paul was beheaded in the city of Rome under the administration of Nero. There is a church, it's in Rome now, but in Paul's day, it was outside of Rome, called St. Paul Outside the Wall. It was outside the city wall then, but it's within Rome itself today. And some remodeling some years ago, a body was found underneath the crypt and underneath the floor of the church there. This body was missing a head, and it carbon-14 dated to the 1st or 2nd centuries. So that might well be the remainings of the body of Paul. Can't prove it, but it is an interesting idea. Well, we can conclude that Paul came from an upper social economic diaspora family, a diaspora meaning outside of Judea, that his family was closely connected with the Herodian faction in Judea. He learned Greek. He had some formal training in Greek because he made some allusions on occasion to some traditional Greek literature, perhaps especially some of the writings of the Stoics. Before his conversion, he was very adamantly anti-Christian, and then we've talked about his Christian connections later. Now, Paul is listed as one of 3 co-authors. The other 2 co-authors are Timothy and Silvanus. Timothy is well known, very beloved figure in the church. Silvanus is not so well known, in part because he's got 2 names. In some places he seems to be called Silas, particularly in Acts, and in Paul's writings he's called Silvanus. We think it's the same person. We're not absolutely sure, of course, but probably so. Okay. Some scholars point out that with 3 people claimed as co-authors, who was responsible for what? Most interpreters say Paul was pretty much responsible for all of it, and Silas or Silvanus and Timothy joined in with this affirmation. But we don't know the exact dynamics that were going on among this trio of early Christian leaders. A number of scholars look at 1 Thessalonians and they say, oh, it doesn't have Paul's distinctive theological emphasis. Well, they get this from the letter to Galatians, where justification by faith becomes the mark of Paul's theology. You find it to a lesser degree in Romans as well. But those are later writings, and they say, there's no justification by faith in 1 Thessalonians. And so they point that out, and it's true, but what do you make of it is very difficult to determine. Let's look at the church at Thessalonica. It was founded on Paul's second missionary journey after he received the so-called Macedonian call. He was in Asia Minor, today Turkey, and he got this call to go to Macedonia, and he responded first by going to Philippi. After he had been mistreated and put in prison, and he witnesses to the Philippian jailer, he went to Thessalonica. The New Testament contains two accounts of the founding of the church there. We have more detail in Book of Acts than we have for the founding of most churches, and we have Paul's own discussion of how he founded the church there. And there are some similarities, but there are also differences. Let's look at the similarities first. Paul's group arrives from Philippi, so they agree on where he came from. They preach and teach to great effect, and so both proclaim the ministry a great success there. The success of the ministry creates problems. It's caused by those who oppose the teaching that Paul and Timothy and Silas have been giving to their group. And then Paul leaves Thessalonica. Unfortunately, the two accounts differ in some detail. In the book of Acts chapter 17, Paul preaches on 3 Sabbaths in the synagogue, and then leaves and doesn't appear to stay there very long after that. The church is comprised of both Jews and Gentiles. There's mob action against Paul, Silas, and Jason. Jason was the owner of what we would call the house church that Paul was creating there. Mob action against Paul and Silas and Jason were led by Jews and ruffians. Paul and Silas and maybe also Timothy leave Thessalonica for Berea. On the other hand, in 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, we have Paul's autobiographical account. And in this, it seems that his ministry is much longer. He works day and night, he says. And from the book of Philippians, Paul writes to tell the Philippians that they sent him assistance more than once while he was laboring in Thessalonica. So given time lags and all that, it seems that if Paul was at Thessalonica longer than a month or so, like it's implied in Acts. Paul says he worked night and day so as not to be a burden. If you're only there for a month, you're probably not going to brag about how long you were working. The church seems comprised mostly of Gentiles, and 1 Thessalonians 1:9, he says that the readers had turned from idols. The Gentiles were persecuting the Gentile Christians, it looks like. Well, we'll look at these a little more detail later on, but you begin to get the picture in Acts, shorter ministry, Jews and Gentiles were primary converts. In 1 Thessalonians, it's a much longer ministry, and his work is mentioned, and it seems that the church is more Gentile. Well, we know a few members of the church. We've already mentioned Jason. It was in his house that the church met, and he was beaten from his house and forced to pay a bond to stay alive, stay free. There's a Jason mentioned in Romans 16, which may be the same Jason, but how or why he would go from Thessalonica to Rome, we don't know. And Jason is not an unusual name. We have the name of Aristarchus. Aristarchus accompanied Paul to Jerusalem at the end of the third missionary tour. He was one of the trustees carrying the cash from the Christians in Thessalonica to the Christians in Jerusalem. This may be the same Aristarchus, we're not sure, who's mentioned in Colossians 4:10, may be the same one. And this Aristarchus in Colossians is imprisoned with Paul, maybe in Rome, but we don't know exactly where. And he is described, the one in Colossians, as a Jewish believer. So he may or may not be the same Aristarchus that's mentioned in 1 Thessalonians. And then there's an individual named Secundus. He's also part of the group that joins with Paul on the third missionary journey. And he's also taking, like Aristarchus, the offering from the Christians in Thessalonica to the Christians in Rome. Now, the place of authorship is Corinth, almost certainly. There's no title page that has the publisher and the place of publication and so forth. But Paul had been at Athens, and he sent Timothy back to Thessalonica. Timothy comes back, and we think Paul didn't stay very long in Athens and went on to Corinth. And that's where Timothy meets up with him. Timothy brings news to Paul about what's happening at the church in Thessalonica. Some of it's good news, but there are some questions that need to be addressed. So the date of authorship for 1 Thessalonians is somewhere between 50 and 52 usually. Again, built around the dating of Gallio as the Roman official there in Corinth. Problems addressed by the letter. Well, Timothy came back with some issues that needed to be addressed. What happens to believers who have died before the return of the Lord? People who had loved ones who died wanted to know what's going to happen. What's going to happen? If Jesus is going to return for the saints, what's going to happen for the deceased saints? When will the end of the world come? When will Christ come back? the problem occurs because some folks seem to have stopped working because they thought the end was so close. Now, we see groups like this every once in a while in the papers or news sources that this group or that group has stopped paying the house mortgage and the utility bills, and they're holed up in the church or the house waiting for the return of the Lord, not working, spending their life in prayer and contemplation and study and so forth, but not earning a buck. And we read about them because they get evicted, their electricity gets turned off or whatever. So this is the kind of thinking that was impacting the church at Thessalonica. And evidently, people had begun to question Paul, his methods, his motives. We don't know exactly what they were saying, but it seems that the autobiographical section is written in part, at any rate, to defend his character in his ministry. Now there are two letters of Paul to the church at Thessalonica, and we call them first and second. The reason we call them first and second is because First Thessalonians is longer than Second Thessalonians. And this is the way the Pauline letters were put into the canon. The longest is First, Romans. The shortest, Philemon, is last. And you have this ordering according to the length of the writings. However, most biblical scholars today think First Thessalonians was written prior to Second Thessalonians. And part of this is the two of the issues that we talked about that plagued the church. One is discussions about the end of time. Paul gets more specific about the end of time in Second Thessalonians than he was in First Thessalonians. And Paul is much more upfront about the need to work in Second Thessalonians than he was in First. First Thessalonians, he wants the people to sort of follow his example and work night and day. And Second Thessalonians, he says, if you don't work, you don't eat. So that's a much more blunt assessment, evidently hinting at it didn't work very well. So First Thessalonians is almost certainly written prior to Second Thessalonians. Let's take a look, just a brief look at Roman letters. Roman letters tended to be short, one page. There was no computer with a printer that you could print it out and so on and so forth. They were all handwritten, usually short and pretty much to the point. Writing itself tended to be very concise, and you didn't spend the money and the time and effort and energy to make long letters. The average length of a letter was about 150 to 250 words. Paul's shortest letter is Philemon. It has 335 words, so it's almost twice as long as the average letter, and it's the shortest of Paul's letters. Romans, his longest, has 114 words, so it's almost 30 times longer than the average letter. And so Paul has a couple of differences here. The length of his letters is much longer, and the content of his letters is vastly different. They're neither personal nor commercial letters, but they are theological in the largest sense of the word theological. Writing was physically very difficult, and so professional scribes were usually used to do this. You know, the paper was roughly grained. It's not real smooth like our paper is. Very, very grainy, and they didn't have computer printers. They had to use those old feather pens and so forth. Very difficult to write. And we know Paul sometimes used scribes because Tertius in Romans writes that he is the one that's writing this. So we have the name of one of Paul's scribes mentioned in the book of Romans. Well, we've covered the introductory material, set the backdrop to the book of 1 Thessalonians. In our next episode, we'll go into the first chapter of 1 Thessalonians. Thank you. Look forward to seeing you next time. God bless you.